Question. Genesis 3:22 King James Version says, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat, and live forever." Who said this? The ascended masters or the fallen beings? Well, you have to watch some of my videos, especially my video about how the world was created, to understand what ascended masters are and what fallen beings are. So I'm not going to go into that here. But let's put it this way. Genesis has some metaphorical significance. It illustrates the process of going into duality. But of course, Genesis was given a long time ago, where people had a much lower state of consciousness, and so you cannot take it literally. If you try to take it literally, you end up in all kinds of quagmires. So, and besides, there are two creation stories in Genesis. You will see when you read it carefully. And but to get back to the question, you can't really give a yes or no answer to this because you have to understand the background for it. So, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. This could actually have been said by the fallen beings. Because the background for this is, of course, if you know Genesis, the idea is that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. And there was a God who was with them. And God had told them that they were allowed to eat all of the trees, all of the fruits in the garden, except one. And that tree was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is completely impossible to understand based on traditional Christianity. Because the symbol here is that the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is the duality consciousness. And it's not that you know good and evil, it's that you define good and evil. I explained that in my videos about non-duality. So the reality here is that the fruits in the garden could be seen as symbols for what the mind can do, the mind's abilities. And the idea was that, well, let's go back a little bit. The Garden of Eden is a symbol for what we can call a mystery school. And I've explained in my video about how the world was created that when we were first created as individual beings, we were in a protected environment along with one or actually several spiritual teachers. So the God in the garden is a symbol for our spiritual teachers, the ascended masters. And the idea was that in this schoolroom, we were going through progressively higher initiations. And at a certain level, not at the beginning levels, but at a higher levels in this mystery school, we were meant to experiment with the duality consciousness, because this is one of the things that the mind can do. And so the idea was that the reason why they had been told not to eat that fruit was because they weren't ready for it yet. They hadn't been prepared well enough by the teacher. And so then they decide to partake of the fruit before they are ready for it. And here's the mystery that is so difficult to explain unless you have ascended master teachings, is that supposedly God had told him, if you eat of the forbidden fruit, you will surely die. And then the tempter, the serpent, tells them, thou shalt not surely die. And they eat the fruit, and lo and behold, they don't die, they are cast out of the garden. So it seems like God lied to them. God lied to Adam and Eve, right? And if you understand it more deeply, you realize first this, they were given instructions based on the beginning level of consciousness, because they weren't ready for that initiation of the duality consciousness. But it wasn't actually really a lie, because you have a certain sense of self. And when you are with the teacher, you're seeing yourself as a connected being. But when you partake of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the duality consciousness, that sense of self as a connected being does die, and you are reborn into a new sense of self as a separate being. And being cast out of the garden is really a symbol for going into this state of separation. So again, you can't take it literally, because then you are going to be confused, right? So you could say then, what is the serpent? Well, the serpent can be understood at different levels, but it's partly that you have in your mind unlimited, unrestricted imagination. That means you can question anything. So you can say, okay, the teacher told us not to eat of this fruit, but what would happen if we do? How bad could it be? Why don't we just try it? So you have this natural drive to experiment with things. And there's nothing really wrong with that, unless you're a cat, then curiosity can kill you. But it's just part of growth that we experiment with things. The problem is that when you go into duality, your sense of being connected dies, and you are reborn as a separate being. Meaning, you can't see the teacher. I mean, they weren't really cast out of paradise. They just couldn't see the teacher anymore. And now they are completely trapped in their own minds, the separate mind, which is based on duality. So there's two opposite polarities, and this is good and evil. In the connected mind, there's no good and evil. There's no distinction between good and evil. There's only what helps you get closer to oneness, what helps you go away, what causes you to go away from oneness. In duality, it's all a quagmire, because everything that's created in duality is unreal. Duality will say, here's the truth, but the truth is an illusion. The lie is also an illusion. Good is an illusion. Evil is an illusion. But you could also step back and say that the serpent is a symbol for the fallen beings, which I explained in my video about how the world is created, what they are. And they have gone into duality. They've gone so deeply into duality, they have lost all sense that there's a reality outside their own minds. They think their minds can define what's real. And this is the problem with duality, that you can become a trap that's very hard to get out of. Because once you are inside the dualistic state of mind, your mind is defining what you think is real and unreal, but you don't see that your mind is defining it. You think what your mind has defined is real and unreal. And therefore, you don't question it. And it's very difficult to question it, because the mind can always come up with arguments for or against anything. That's the problem with this, what we can call the serpentine mind. There is no ultimate truth there. It's like Jesus said about the devil, there is no truth in him. And the duality consciousness, there is no truth there. So that's why it's this self-reinforcing spiral that's very difficult to get out of. So, going back to the question, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. And this is again where you can't take it literally, because you can put it this way. When you see yourself as a connected being, you are increasing your sense of connection. You're walking up the path, as I've said. You start at the 48th level, that's when you see yourself as connected. There are 144 levels of consciousness, and you can walk up. When you reach the highest level, you can ascend, and that's when you become a permanent being. That's when you live forever. Before that, you're not immortal. You are a mortal being. But then when you go into separation, that's when you go into duality, and from that state of consciousness, you can't partake of the fruit of eternal life. It's just impossible. So it really isn't. It isn't that God said, or the ascended master said, "Oh, he's gone into duality before he becomes immortal. Let's cast him out of paradise." It's just a primitive way of describing the process that when you go into duality, you cannot attain immortal life. You cannot become immortal. This is what the fallen beings believe. They believe that they can elevate the separate self to such a status that God will have to let it into heaven because it's become so sophisticated. And it will never happen. It's from the very beginning an impossible quest. And so, again, you could, it's not that it's completely invalid what's in Genesis, but it's just you cannot take it literally. You have to really understand it in a bigger context. And I fully understand why so many people who have been brought up in a environment where they're taught about the Old Testament, why they are confused about this. I mean, I was very confused about it. And I understand why many people have turned away from it. In fact, my own mother, she told me once that when she was very young, probably just started in school, they had these classes in the Bible, and it came to this point where they learned that Adam and Eve had 3 sons, and all the rest of humanity descended from these 3 sons. And she was 7, 8 years old, and she could see, well, sons can't have children, so this has got to be a lie. And from that moment on, she rejected all religion the rest of her life. Never wanted to think about or talk about anything religious or spiritual, because for her, religion and spirituality, that was just all the same. So I totally understand why the incomplete, distorted teachings of the Bible and of Christianity have turned many people away, not only from religion, but from spirituality. I think they're throwing the baby out with the dirty bathwater, because there is a reality to spirituality behind religion. But, I can understand why, if you don't have any spiritual teaching that can make this make sense to you, I understand why many people go into just rejecting the whole thing. The problem is then they end up in atheism or scientific materialism, and it doesn't give you much in terms of a sense of purpose of life. So it's kind of like, again, you're between a rock and a hard spot. And the reason for this is, if you think about it, that you have this, the biblical religions, the Abrahamic religions, the theistic religions, they represent one dualistic extreme. And scientific materialism and atheism represent the other dualistic extreme. So it actually illustrates the danger of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Because the current view of religion, of these religions, is created from the duality consciousness, from the mind, the separate mind. And materialism, scientific materialism, is created from the separate mind. And people think that's the only option there is. There's nothing in between. There's nothing beyond it. And therefore they are trapped there, ping-ponging back and forth. I think there are probably people who have been religious for several lifetimes, then they have been disappointed by religion, they flip over to some form of atheism, they are atheists for several lifetimes, they come to one, they can't stand it anymore, and then maybe they flip back to religion, and maybe they go back and forth. But I also think there are some people that go back and forth for several lifetimes, and then they come to a point where they suddenly think, could there be an alternative to these two opposites? Is there some middle way? Is there some way to make sense out of life? And that's when they become open to a spiritual path that gives them a teaching that's beyond this. And there are many valid spiritual teachings. There are also some that are not valid because they also come from the duality consciousness, and they are attempting to explain it based on that. But there are certainly many valid spiritual teachings that come from a level beyond the duality consciousness, and ultimately that is the Ascended Masters, who are our spiritual teachers. They are assigned, as I have explained many times, they are assigned to help us get out of duality once we become stuck in it. And it really is the only way to get out of duality, because duality, as I explained in my non-duality videos, becomes a self-reinforcing, self-validating system. And you can't get out of it by the powers of the mind. You have to reach for something beyond your own mind, which is ultimately the Christ mind, and then helps you to gradually climb out of this abyss of duality and separation.